The early morning light broke over the tree-lined parade grounds of Quantico Marine Corps Base, carrying with it a sense of expectancy. Soldiers on guard at the main gate stood with deliberate composure, yet even they knew this day was not routine. Quantico, often the quiet hub for Marine Corps training and leadership development, had become the focal point of a pivotal moment in US military history. Across the sprawling base, service members prepared for the arrival of a leader who had promised to confront what he called decades of decay. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth had summoned hundreds of generals and admirals from every corner of the globe. To pull so many senior leaders from their posts was itself extraordinary, a sign that the Pentagon meant to do more than issue another white paper directive. The gathering was billed as both a reckoning and a reset, intended to address years of drift, inefficiency, and eroding focus in the armed forces. Helicopters descended in a neat, deliberate landing pattern as the Defense Secretary arrived under heavy security. Cameras caught him stepping briskly onto the tarmac, flanked by aides and greeted by Marine officers. The weather was mild, the atmosphere anything but. In the hall where the assembly gathered, the mood was at once solemn and curious. This was not an ordinary briefing. The stakes were framed in the first words Hegseth delivered. Standing at the podium before the nation's top military leadership, he declared with sharp criticism, "The military has been forced by foolish and reckless politicians to focus on the wrong things. In many ways, this speech is about fixing decades of decay, some of it obvious, some of it hidden. Or, as the chairman has put it, we are clearing out the debris." Those words echoed across the hall, not only because of their bluntness, but because they captured a sentiment that many in uniform had felt for years. For some, it was a public admission that what had been whispered in corridors of power was finally being said aloud. For others, it was a reminder that the institution they had dedicated their lives to had, in their view, lost its way. The speech's core theme was not about foreign adversaries, as so many defense addresses tend to be, but about introspection, the military's own structure, priorities, and the political interference that had shaped them. Hegseth's statement that the forces had been directed toward the wrong things implied that decades of policy debates, shifting goals, and partisan agendas had compromised combat readiness. The Secretary's challenge was to restore focus, discipline, and effectiveness in a system often bogged down by bureaucracy and competing political visions. Throughout the gathering, the Secretary outlined a sweeping vision for reform. He described plans to modernize logistics, overhaul training standards, and reduce what he called politically fashionable distractions. He urged a cultural shift, not only in the way resources were allocated, but in how leaders understood the military's core mission. This was not merely about acquiring new technologies or increasing budgets. It was about realigning priorities so that the men and women in uniform could concentrate on defending the nation rather than navigating an ever-expanding list of peripheral demands. Observers in Washington noted that the tone of the address harked back to earlier eras of military reform. After the Vietnam War in the 1970s, the armed forces underwent painful but necessary recalibration to rebuild morale and professionalism. In the 1990s, following the Cold War, defense leaders had restructured forces to adapt to a changing global threat landscape. Yet in neither of those periods had a sitting Secretary of Defense so openly placed blame on political leadership for the military's condition. Hegseth's blunt words suggested not merely a policy shift, but an institutional confrontation. For the officers in the hall, the moment carried a mix of relief and apprehension. Many had long argued that sustained attention to core readiness, training, equipment, logistics, and morale had been undermined by fluctuating political priorities. Yet implementing sweeping reforms would mean difficult changes in how commands operated, how resources were distributed, and perhaps most significantly, how civilian oversight interacted with military leadership. The imagery of the day underscored this sense of both tradition and transformation. Outside the main auditorium, the base continued with its usual rhythms: groundskeepers tending to lawns, Marines in training rotations. Inside, leaders were asked to reflect on what had gone wrong and how to set it right. The contrast between the continuity of daily military life and the urgency of reform captured the challenge ahead, to transform without losing sight of enduring duty. Journalists who covered the event described the mood as unusually candid for such a high-level meeting. The phrase "decades of decay" became a headline in itself, fueling debate in Washington and on television panels about how much of the problem lay in policy versus leadership versus institutional inertia. Analysts emphasized that meaningful change would require not only directives from the Pentagon, but cooperation and funding from Congress, where partisan divisions over defense spending had often stalled major initiatives. Hegseth's remarks also raised questions about the delicate balance between civilian control of the military and the need for the armed forces to set professional standards for readiness and effectiveness. His criticism of foolish and reckless politicians was seen by some as a bold truth-telling moment and by others as an implicit challenge to established norms of civil-military relations. The conference at Quantico extended beyond speeches into working sessions where officers and civilian leaders mapped out immediate priorities. Reports indicated that topics included streamlining procurement systems that had often delayed critical weapons and equipment upgrades, reforming training modules to emphasize combat-relevant skills, and strengthening alliances with key partners to address 21st century threats. Much of this work took place away from cameras, but the Secretary's opening words had already set a high bar for accountability. Outside the auditorium, the symbolism of the event continued. As the sun set over the parade grounds, the flag-lowering ceremony played out with its usual precision, a daily ritual that seemed to anchor the institution in its traditions, even as leaders debated transformative change inside. For many service members, the day closed with a renewed sense of purpose, but also uncertainty about what reforms would mean for their own units and careers. Hegseth departed the base as he had arrived by helicopter, leaving behind both a challenge and a promise. His metaphor of clearing out the debris suggested not a quick fix, but a prolonged effort to dismantle entrenched habits and recenter the military's mission. For supporters, it was a call to restore strength and clarity. For skeptics, it raised doubts about whether such a sweeping reset could succeed in the face of political headwinds and institutional inertia. In the days that followed, reactions poured in from retired generals, defense scholars, and political leaders. Some praised the address as a necessary wake-up call to an institution that had grown complacent. Others warned that blaming political leadership risked alienating the very lawmakers needed to approve the budgets and policies required for reform. Still, others questioned whether the Secretary's vision was specific enough to overcome decades-long procurement bottlenecks and bureaucratic resistance. What is clear is that the speech marked a turning point in the national conversation about defence priorities. By centering the discussion on readiness and core mission focus, rather than on specific adversaries, Hegseth reframed the debate. In an era defined by rapidly shifting global threats and technological change, he reminded the nation that military strength ultimately depends not just on weapon systems or budgets, but on the clarity of purpose that guides them. For the journalists chronicling the moment, the scene at Quantico offered a vivid tableau, the world's most powerful military power pausing to look inward, to scrutinize its own direction, and to confront its own shortcomings. The story was as much about institutional culture as about policy, as much about restoring focus as about deploying new tools. Whether the reforms outlined that day will take hold remains uncertain. History offers examples of bold speeches followed by modest change, as well as instances where decisive leadership reshaped entire institutions. The months and years to come will test whether the pledges made at Quantico in late September 2025 were the opening chapter of a genuine transformation or merely another cycle in a long tradition of reformist rhetoric. For now, the image of that gathering and of rows of decorated officers listening intently to a defense secretary speaking with unvarnished urgency stands as a symbol of a military at a crossroads. The phrase "decades of decay" will continue to echo in policy circles, press briefings, and congressional hearings, a reminder of both the challenges that lie behind and the uncertain path ahead. As night fell on Quantico that historic day, the base returned to its usual routines. Yet the ideas set forth in that hall promised that the routine itself might never quite be the same again. The coming reforms, if enacted, could redefine training, procurement, strategy, and even the relationship between the military and the society it serves. And for all who listened to Hegseth's pledge to clear out the debris of the past, the question that lingered was not whether change was needed, but whether this time change would truly come.
The military has been forced by foolish and reckless politicians to focus on the wrong things. In many ways, this speech is about fixing decades of decay. Some of it obvious, some of it hidden. Or as the chairman has put it, we are clearing out the debris.